The laughter cut through the diner like a blade, too loud and too cruel, and every head at the counter turned toward the corner booth, where a man in a charcoal sport coat was pointing at the back of another man's hands. "Look at that," the man in the sport coat said, loud enough for the whole room. "You let somebody scribble all over you like a bathroom wall, and now you have to wear it forever. That's not art. That's a confession nobody asked for." The man with the tattooed hands did not turn around. He sat alone at the counter, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him, his spine straight, his shoulders wide under a faded denim shirt. The ink ran from his knuckles, up past his cuffs, old lines gone soft with years. A compass rose, a pair of dates, a small bird with a broken wing. He lifted the cup. He drank. He set it down without a sound. The waitress behind the counter felt the back of her neck go cold. She had worked the late shift at the Bright Star for 11 years, and she knew the difference between a man who was about to break and a man who was choosing not to. The man at the counter was the second kind, and that frightened her more. His name was Eddie Vance, though no one in the diner knew it yet, and the dates on his right hand were the only thing in the room that mattered. The Bright Star Diner sat at the dead end of a frontage road off the interstate, a chrome and glass box that had outlived 3 owners and 2 recessions. The booths were the original red vinyl, cracked and patched with tape that no longer matched, and the counter was a long sweep of worn formica scarred with cigarette burns from the years before anybody made you take it outside. A pie case turned slowly under a humming bulb. The coffee was bad and bottomless, and that was the whole appeal of the place. People did not come to the Bright Star for the food. They came because it was open when nothing else was, and because nobody there asked you a single question you did not want to answer. At 11 at night, it held the people the rest of the town had no use for. A trucker nursing a coffee before his next leg, a heavy-set man with sunburned arms and a logbook opened beside his plate, figuring hours he did not have. 2 nurses coming off a double at the county hospital, still in their scrubs, too tired to talk, eating cobbler in the slow, ruined silence of people who have spent 12 hours holding other people's lives in their hands. An old man named Roy, who came every single night and ordered the same slice of pie and never finished it, and who had been doing this since his wife passed, because eating pie he did not want in a place that stayed lit was easier than going home to a dark house. And now this, a loud table of 4, in good clothes, who had wandered in from somewhere better and decided the diner was a stage built for their amusement. The man in the charcoal coat was named Brett Halloran, and Brett Halloran was used to rooms arranging themselves around him. He sold luxury cars at the dealership his father owned out on the commercial strip, German sedans and oversized trucks to men who wanted other men to know they had money. And he was good at it because selling a car is mostly about making the buyer feel like the kind of person who deserves the car, and Brett had a gift for flattery that curdled the moment a person stopped being useful to him. He had spent the evening at the steakhouse 2 exits up the interstate with 3 colleagues from the dealership, celebrating a quarter that had gone well, and the wine had been expensive and plentiful, and it had made him generous with his opinions. The dinner had run late. Somebody had wanted coffee before the drive home, and the steakhouse had closed its kitchen, and so they had drifted down the frontage road to the only lit sign still burning, and Brett had walked into the Bright Star already looking for an audience. He had noticed the tattooed man the moment they walked in. Men like Brett always noticed, men like Eddie. It was the noticing that gave them away. A man, secure in himself, walks past a stranger without a thought. A man who needs the world arranged in a particular order, with himself near the top of it, cannot let a man like Eddie sit unranked and unbothered at a counter. He has to put him somewhere. He has to put him beneath. I'm serious, Brett said to his table, gesturing with his fork. My old man says you can read a man's whole credit history off his skin. Guy like that, you don't loan him $1. You don't let him near your daughter. You cross the street. One of the colleagues laughed, because laughing was easier than not. His name was Dale, and he had a wife at home, and a mortgage he was barely ahead of, and laughing at Brett's jokes was part of what kept the commissions flowing, and he hated himself a little every time he did it. The other two looked at their plates. The youngest of them, a kid named Marcus, barely a year out of community college, had taken the job because it paid better than anything else in town, and he was beginning to understand, in the slow, sinking way a person understands these things, exactly what the job was going to cost him. Eddie Vance turned a page of the newspaper he was not reading. The waitress, whose name was Carmen, came around the counter with the coffee pot and refilled Eddie's cup, though it did not need refilling. It was the only kindness she could think to offer. Up close, she could see his eyes. Pale, gray, and tired, the eyes of a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and had not set it down. He gave her a small nod. The kind of nod that said he had heard everything and that none of it was her fault. "Thank you," he said. His voice was quiet, sanded down. "You don't have to mind them on my account. I'm not minding them on your account," Carmen said. "I'm minding them on mine." That earned the ghost of a smile. What Brett Halloran did not know, what no one in the Bright Star Diner knew except Eddie himself, was that the compass rose on his left hand had been inked the night he buried a brother on a hillside in another state, and that the broken-winged bird marked a daughter he had not seen in 19 years. And that the two dates on his right hand were the day he had pulled a stranger from a burning car, and the day that stranger had died anyway in a hospital corridor, while Eddie held his hand. The ink was not a confession. The ink was a graveyard he carried, so the graves would never be alone. That is not the part of the story that matters most, though. The part that matters is who was sitting in the next booth, in the shadow past the jukebox, where the neon from the window did not reach. He had come in 20 minutes before Brett Halloran's table, ordered a patty melt and a glass of water, and said almost nothing since. He was a big man, heavy-set and barrel-chested, well over 6 feet, even folded into a vinyl booth, and he wore a black leather cut over a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up over forearms thick as fence posts. His beard was full and iron gray, and across the back of the cut, had anyone bothered to look, was the rocker of the Ash Creek Wardens, and over the left breast a small patch that read President. His name was Walt Brennan, and he had been Eddie Vance's friend for 31 years. Walt had not said anything because Walt was listening. He was good at listening. It was the thing that had made him president of the Wardens through 2 decades that should have broken the club apart. Through the year, the old president died, and 3 men wanted the gavel. Through the season, the county tried to zone them out of their own clubhouse. Through funerals and prison sentences, and the slow attrition of men who simply got too old to ride. Walt had held it all together, not by being the loudest man in the room, but by being the one who heard everything and spoke last. He had learned long ago that a man revealed everything about himself in how he treated people who could not hurt him back, a man's manners toward a waitress, a stray dog, a stranger at a counter. That was the whole of him written plain. Everything else was performance. He had watched Brett Halloran the way a man watches weather coming across open country, reading the shape of it, gauging when it would break. He had watched Dale's laugh, thin out, and die. He had watched the kid, Marcus, go quiet and small. He had watched Carmen pour coffee that did not need pouring, and he had understood exactly what that pour meant, because Walt had spent his whole life among people who said the truest things with their hands when their mouths were not allowed. And he had watched Eddie, his oldest friend in the world, sit with his back straight and take it, the way Eddie always took things, because Eddie had decided a long time ago that he would never again be the reason a room turned ugly. 31 years Walt had known him. Then, they had met young and stupid and angry, two men with nothing, and they had built something together out of that nothing. A brotherhood and a code and long string of years, and in all that time Walt had watched Eddie give and give, and he had watched Eddie carry losses that would have hollowed out a lesser man. And he had watched him decide, somewhere along the way, that the price of his own grief was silence, that the decent thing, the only thing, was to swallow it and sit in the corner and never trouble anybody. Walt had let him believe that for a long time. Tonight, in a chrome diner at the end of a frontage road, Walt had decided he was done letting him. Walt set his fork down on the edge of his plate. He did not get up, not yet. A thing done too soon is just noise, and Walt had not stayed alive this long by making noise. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, a small habit the way some men crack their knuckles, and he waited to see how far Brett Halloran intended to go. Brett intended to go further. "Hey," Brett called out across the diner to the back of Eddie's head. "Hey, Ink, I'm talking to you. You deaf or just slow?" The diner went quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that presses on the ears. The trucker set down his coffee. One of the nurses reached for her purse strap without knowing she had done it. Carmen stood frozen by the pie case, with the pot still in her hand. Eddie Vance turned around on his stool. He did it slowly, without drama, the way an old door opens. He looked at Brett Halloran across the length of the diner, and there was no anger in his face, only a deep and patient weariness. The look of a man who had seen 100 Bretts and knew exactly how this went. "I can hear you fine," Eddie said. "I was hoping you'd run out of things to say before I had to answer." Brett grinned. He thought he had won something. He thought the quiet was for him. "There it is," Brett said, turning to his table. "He speaks. So tell me, tough guy, what's the bird for? You lose a fight with a parakeet?" A couple of the colleagues laughed. The laugh was thinner now. Some animal part of them had begun to register that the room had changed, that the silence at the counter was not fear, but something older and harder. But Brett was 3 glasses of wine past listening to animal instincts. Eddie looked down at his own left hand, at the small bird with the broken wing, and for a moment his face changed, not toward Brett, toward something far away. "The bird's not for you," Eddie said quietly. "None of it's for you. That's the part you can't understand. You think a man marks himself to be looked at. I marked myself so I wouldn't forget." "Forget what?" Brett sneered. "Your parole date." And that was the sentence. That was the one too many. It was not the cruelest thing Brett had said all night. It was almost careless, tossed out for the easy laugh, the kind of line a man like Brett had said 100 times in 100 rooms, without ever once watching where it landed. Cruelty does not need to be clever to do its work, and this particular cruelty had found, by pure rotten luck, the exact wound it was least entitled to touch. The system had taken Eddie's daughter and called it justice. The system had let a drunk man walk free from a fire, and now a soft-handed stranger in a charcoal coat had looked at the marks Eddie carried for all of it and called them the record of a criminal. In the back booth, past the jukebox, Walt Brennan turned his coffee cup one more quarter turn, and then he stopped, turning it, and he stood up. He did not stand up fast. He unfolded from the booth slowly, joint by joint, the way a mountain would stand if a mountain could, and the vinyl creaked, and the floor seemed to take note of him. The leather cut settled across his shoulders. He was a wide man, and the diner was not built for men his size, and as he stepped out from the shadow of the jukebox, the neon caught the gray of his beard and the worn patches on his chest, and Carmen, watching from the pie case, felt her heart climb into her throat. Brett Halloran heard the creak and turned. What he saw did not register all at once. First he saw size, then he saw leather, then slowly he saw the patches, and somewhere in the wine-soaked back rooms of his mind a door began to close. Walt crossed the diner without hurry. He did not look at Brett. He walked past the loud table as though it were empty, and went to the counter and put one heavy, scarred hand on Eddie Vance's shoulder, and the two men looked at each other, and something passed between them that no one else in the room could read. 31 years lived in that look. Walt squeezed once. Then he turned finally and faced the table of four, and he spoke, and his voice was a low gravel rumble that did not need to be loud to fill the room. "Evening," Walt said. Nobody answered. "You've been doing a lot of talking," Walt said to Brett. "I've been listening. Figured I'd come introduce myself before you said something you couldn't walk back." Brett's mouth opened. The bluster was still in there somewhere, fighting to come out, because Brett Halloran had never in his life been in a room where his name and his father's name and the dealership on the strip did not buy him the last word. "This is a private conversation," Brett managed. "No," Walt said. "It stopped being private when you started shouting it across a diner." He pulled a chair from a neighboring table, turned it around, and sat down at the end of the booth, his forearms folded across the back of it, close enough now that Brett could smell the road on him, leather and engine and cold night air. The two colleagues nearest the wall pressed themselves into the vinyl. The third one, the youngest, had gone very pale and very still. "Let me tell you about the man you've been talking to," Walt said. "Then you can decide if you want to keep going. I don't need a story," Brett said, but the words came out smaller than he meant them to. "You're going to get one anyway," Walt said. "That bird on his hand, the broken wing. He got that ink the year his little girl was taken out of state, by a woman who told the courts, pile of lies. And he didn't have the money to fight it. And the system that's supposed to look out for a man like him looked right through him. 19 years he's been carrying that bird. 19 years he's woken up every morning and looked at his own hand so he wouldn't let himself forget her face. You called it a parole date." The diner was silent. The old man with the pie was staring openly now, fork suspended. "The two dates, on the other hand," Walt went on, and his voice did not rise, but it deepened, the way the ground deepens before a quarry. "First one's the night this man pulled a stranger out of a car that was already on fire. Highway 9, middle of a January night. Nobody else would stop. He went in through the flames, and he got that man out, burned his own hands doing it. And the second date is the day that stranger died anyway, in a hospital, with this man holding his hand, because the fella had no family that would come. He marked both days on his skin, so the man he couldn't save would have somebody remembering him. That's your confession nobody asked for. That's your bathroom wall." Brett Halloran said nothing. The wine had gone sour in him. His hands, manicured and ringless, lay flat on the table as if he had forgotten what to do with them. "Now me," Walt said, and here he leaned forward an inch, and the inch was enough. Eddie pulled that stranger out of the fire 11 years ago. The stranger's name doesn't matter to you, but the man who was driving the truck that caused that wreck, drunk, who walked away and left 2 cars burning and never even slowed down, he had a lawyer and a name and a daddy with a dealership, and he never spent a single night in a cell. Sound like anybody you know? Something flickered in Brett's face. Not recognition exactly, worse than recognition. The first cold touch of a possibility he did not want to look at directly. "I don't know what you're talking about," Brett whispered. "Maybe you don't," Walt said. "Maybe it was your cousin, your old man, somebody at your country club. Maybe it was you. Doesn't matter. The point is, I've spent 11 years sitting in diners like this one, watching men in nice coats decide that a man's worth is written on the outside and being wrong every single time. And I am tired of it. I am so tired of it." The chair scraped. Brett flinched. Walt Brennan did not raise a hand, though he never would. That was the thing the Bretts of the world never understood, right up until the moment it was explained to them. The power in the room had never been in anyone's fists. "Here's what's going to happen," Walt said. And now the gravel in his voice flattened into something even and final, the voice of a man reading a verdict. "You're going to leave money on your table for your dinner and 100 more for the trouble you caused this lady working the counter. You're going to walk out that door. You're going to get in whatever German car your daddy gave you, and you're going to drive home. And every morning when you shave, you're going to look at your own face in the mirror, the one with no marks on it, the one that's never had to remember anything. And you're going to ask yourself what a man's skin is really worth." He paused. The diner held its breath. "And one more thing," Walt said. Quieter now, almost gentle, which was somehow worse. "You're going to remember this night. Not because I scared you I didn't lay a hand on you, and I'm not going to. You're going to remember it because for about 90 seconds in a diner, you'll never come back to, you saw yourself clear. Most men like you go a whole life and never get that. Consider it a gift. I don't expect thanks." And then Brett Halloran did the thing that men like him always do at the end. He broke, not loudly. The bluster did not explode out of him. It leaked. His shoulders came down, his eyes went wet and bright and small. He fumbled for his wallet with shaking fingers and put down far more than $100 bills, scattering across the table, 20s and 50s spilling like leaves. And he stood, and he could not look at Eddie Vance, and he could not look at Walt, and he certainly could not look at his own silent colleagues who were seeing all 3 of them at once. The man they worked for stripped down to exactly what he was. "I didn't," Brett started. "I didn't mean." "I know what you meant," Walt said. "Go home." Brett Halloran went home. He walked out into the parking lot where the night had gone cold and clear, and he stopped halfway to his car. And for a long moment he stood under the sodium orange light, with his hand pressed over his mouth. And what he felt was not the wine wearing off. It was something he had spent his whole protected life avoiding. It was the weight of having been seen, fully and accurately, by people he had been taught to look down on, and found small. His colleagues filed out behind him without a word. The youngest one paused at the door, looked back at Eddie at the counter, and gave a small, ashamed nod, the closest thing to an apology the night would produce. Then they were gone, and the headlights swept across the diner window, and the bright star was quiet. Again, Carmen came out from behind the counter. Her hands were trembling now that it was over, the way hands do when the danger has passed. She gathered the scattered bills, and she counted them. And her eyes went wide, and she looked up at the 2 men. she said, this is more than $400. Keep it, Walt said. He had returned to his booth and was easing himself back into it. Buy something for yourself. You earned it, standing there, not running. Can't take this, Carmen said. You can, Eddie said gently, and you should. He won't miss it. And a man like that needs to learn that the money he throws around lands on people who matter more than he does. Carmen looked down at the bills in her hand. And then she did something none of them expected. She set them on the counter, went to the kitchen, and came back with 2 enormous slices of apple pie, warm, with the ice cream already melting at the edges, and she set one in front of Eddie and carried the other back to Walt's booth. On the house, she said. Both of you, and don't argue with me because I've had a longer night than either of you. And I'll cry if you argue. Neither of them argued. Eddie Vance ate his pie slowly at the counter, and Walt Brennan ate his in the back booth. And for a while, neither man said anything because the kind of friendship they had did not require talking to feel full. The jukebox, which had been silent through the whole ordeal, clicked over to some old country song, low and warm. The trucker finished his coffee and left a good tip and tipped his cap to both men on his way out. The 2 nurses lingered over their cobbler and watched the bikers the way you watch a fire. You have decided, safe. After a while, Eddie picked up his coffee and carried it back to the booth and sat down across from his friend. You didn't have to do that, Eddie said. I know I didn't, Walt said. I wanted to. I had it handled. You always think you've got it handled, Walt said. That's your whole problem. You'd sit there and take it all night, because you decided 30 years ago that the worst thing you could do is cause a scene. But there's a difference between causing a scene and refusing to disappear. You've been confusing the two since I met you. Eddie turned the coffee cup in his hands, and the dates on his right hand caught the light, and Walt looked at them, the way he had looked at them 1,000 times. You ever hear from her? Walt asked the girl. Eddie was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. She'd be 26 now. I look her up sometimes. There's a woman with her name in a city up north. Could be her. Could be 100 people. I never reach out. Why not? Because she got a life, Eddie said. Whatever her mother told her about me, she built a life on top of it. What right have I got to come tearing in 19 years late and knock the whole thing down just so I can feel better? He looked at the bird on his hand. Some things you carry, you don't put them down on other people. Walt nodded slowly. He understood this. The wardens were full of men carrying things they would not put down on other people. It was, in a way, the entire architecture of the club, a brotherhood of men who had decided that whatever weight they could not set down, at least they would not have to hold it alone. You know what your trouble is, Walt said. You think carrying a thing alone is the same as honoring it. It isn't. The girl, the fella from the fire, all of it. You think the only respectful way to grieve is in silence, off in a corner, not bothering anybody. But that's not honor, Eddie. That's just hiding with a better excuse. Eddie said nothing. That man tonight, Walt went on. He looked at your hands and he saw garbage. And you let him. Because some part of you, after all these years, after the courts and the fire and the kid, some part of you still wonders if he's right. That's the part I stood up for. Not your pride. I stood up because I am not going to sit in a booth and watch my oldest friend agree with the worst thing anybody ever said about him. The words landed somewhere deep. Eddie's jaw worked. He looked out the window at the empty parking lot, at the chrome of his own motorcycle catching the streetlight beside Walt's. Two old machines leaned on their kickstands in the cold. "How'd you find me here, anyway?" Eddie said finally, changing the subject the way men do when a thing has gotten too true. "I didn't tell anybody where I was eating." "I didn't find you," Walt said. "I've been driving the same lonesome roads as you for 31 years. We end up in the same diners." "That's not fate. That's just two old men with the same bad taste in coffee," Eddie laughed. It came out rough, unused, but it was a real laugh. The first one in the diner all night that did not cut. They stayed another hour. Carmen kept the coffee coming and would not take a cent for it. The two nurses left, and the old man finally finished his pie, all of it. For the first time anyone could remember, as though the night had reminded him that some things were worth finishing, and when at last the two men rose to go, Walt put a hand on Carmen's shoulder, gentle as a man that size could be. "You ever have trouble in here," he said. "Real trouble, the kind that scares you. You call this number." He wrote it on a napkin. "Don't matter the hour. Somebody'll come." Carmen took the napkin and held it like it was something more valuable than the bills still sitting on the counter. "Why," she said, "you don't even know me." "I know you poured a stranger a cup of coffee he didn't need," Walt said, "because you couldn't think of any other way to tell him he wasn't alone. That's all I need to know about anybody." The two men walked out into the cold. Their boots were loud on the asphalt. The night had gone still and enormous overhead. A great wash of stars past the orange streetlight, and the two motorcycles waited where they had been left. Eddie pulled on his gloves, careful the way he did everything, and Walt watched him. "There's a fella," Walt said as he settled onto his bike. "Friend of a friend. Does work for people who can't afford it. Finds people who don't want to be found when there's a good reason. I could make a call. No pressure. Just so you'd know whether the woman up north is her." Eddie's hands went still on the grips. "And if it is her," Eddie said, "and she doesn't want to know me." "Then you'll know that too," Walt said. "And you can let it go for real instead of carrying a question around for the rest of your life. There's two kinds of carrying, Eddie. The kind you choose and the kind you're just too scared to set down. You taught me the difference yourself, about 40 years ago, only you forgot it somewhere along the way. Let me remind you." For a long moment, Eddie Vance sat on his motorcycle in the cold and looked at nothing. His breath fogged in the streetlight. The bird with the broken wing sat there on the back of his hand where it had always been. "Make the call," Eddie said. Walt nodded once. He did not smile, because smiling was not the Warden way, but something eased in his big shoulders, and that was its own kind of smile. They started their engines, and the sound of them filled the empty lot and rolled out across the frontage road and into the dark. Two old machines and two old men, and the windows of the Bright Star Diner glowed warm behind them. Inside, Carmen stood at the window and watched the taillights shrink and vanish toward the interstate. She held the napkin with the phone number in one hand, and in the other she finally picked up the scattered bills and put them in her apron pocket, because a man she respected had told her to, and she had decided to believe him. 3 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, Eddie Vance stood outside a small brick house in a city up north with a paper in his pocket that said the woman who lived there had been born on a date that matched exactly the day he had last held his daughter. He had driven 6 hours. The ride had taken him up out of the warm, low country and into a colder, harder landscape of brick mill towns and shuttered factories. The kind of places where the work had left and the people had stayed. And the whole way north, the bird on his hand had felt heavier than it had in years, the way an old wound aches before a change in weather. He had stopped twice on the side of the road, once because his hands were shaking too hard to ride, and he had stood at a guardrail over a gray river and breathed until the shaking passed. And once, 40 miles out, because he had nearly turned around, had actually swung the bike toward the median before something stopped him, some thread of the thing Walt had said about the two kinds of carrying, and he had sat there with the engine idling for 10 full minutes before he pointed the front wheel north again. Walt had ridden the whole way beside him and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and because the not saying was the whole point of him being there. At the guardrail, he had simply stood a few feet off, looking at the river, giving his friend the dignity of falling apart in private, while making sure he did not fall apart alone. When Eddie had finally swung the bike back toward the road, Walt had nodded once, and that was the whole of his counsel, and it had been enough. Eddie did not go to the door that day. He sat on his motorcycle across the street for 2 hours, and he watched the windows, and at one point a woman came out to bring in the mail, and she was tall, and she moved the way Eddie's own mother had moved, and Eddie put his fist over his mouth, the way Brett Halloran had done in the parking lot 3 weeks before. Except that what was in Eddie was not shame. It was 19 years of a held breath, finally let go. He did not approach her. Not that day. That night, though, he wrote a letter in a motel room, and Walt mailed it for him so Eddie could not take it back, and the letter did not ask for anything. It did not ask for forgiveness, or a meeting, or a place in her life. It only said, "I am the man whose hand has had a broken bird on it since the day you were taken from me, and I have thought of you every single morning of your life. And you owe me nothing. And I wanted you to know that somewhere in the world there is a person who never once stopped loving you." There was a phone number at the bottom. There was nothing else. For 11 days, the phone did not ring. On the 12th day, it did. That is a longer story, though, and it belongs to Eddie and the woman up north, and it is not, for these pages, what belongs here is smaller and quieter. What belongs here is a Tuesday, a month after that phone call, back at the Bright Star Diner, at the dead end of the frontage road, at 11 o'clock at night. Eddie Vance sat in the back booth past the jukebox. The booth that had once been Walt's, with a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him, and a slice of apple pie he had not touched. He was not hiding in the corner. He had chosen the booth because from it you could see the whole room and the door and the parking lot beyond, and a man who had spent his life refusing to disappear had finally learned the difference between sitting in the dark and sitting where he could keep watch. Carmen brought the coffee pot around and refilled a cup that did not need refilling, because some habits are too good to break, and she slid into the booth across from him for a minute the way she had started doing on the slow nights. "She's still coming Sunday?" Carmen asked. "Driving down Saturday," Eddie said. "Staying through Monday." He turned the cup a quarter turn on the table, a habit he had picked up somewhere from someone without ever noticing. "She wants to meet Waltz. Says anybody who'd ride 6 hours to mail a letter for a stubborn old man is somebody she needs to shake hands with." Carmen smiled. "What'd you tell her?" "I told her to bring an appetite," Eddie said, "because the man eats like a bear coming out of winter, and if she's going to be around this family, she might as well learn that on the first night." He had said it without thinking. This family. The words just came out, the way true things do when a man has finally stopped guarding the door of his own mouth. Carmen looked at him for a moment, and then she looked down at the table, because there are things you do not stare at directly. the way you do not stare at the sun, and a man saying the word family for the first time in 19 years is one of them. She got kids? Carmen asked, careful, giving him an easy place to put his eyes. Ichu, Eddie said, and his voice did something it had not done all night. It cracked, just slightly, just at the edge. A boy and a girl, the girl's 7. Her names? He stopped. He turned the cup again. Her names, after nobody. Her mother just liked it. But the boy she named for her own father, she told me. The man who raised her after I was gone. A good man. A school custodian who never had 2 nickels but who showed up to every single thing that child ever did. He looked up at Carmen, and there was no bitterness in it. None at all. Only a kind of awed gratitude. I spent 19 years hating a man I'd never met for raising my daughter. Turns out he did a better job than I ever could have. Turns out I owe him everything. He passed 2 years back. I'll never get to thank him. So I figure the least I can do is be worth the trouble she's taking to come find out who I am. Outside, far off down the frontage road, came a sound. An engine, then another, then the low collective thunder of more, rolling in from the dark toward the warm, glowing windows of the diner, and Carmen looked up, and for half a second the old fear touched her, the animal memory of headlights and trouble. Then she saw Eddie's face. He was not afraid. He was smiling, a real smile, the broken bird on his hand resting easy on the table, and he was watching the door the way a man watches for people he loves to come through it. "That'll be them," Eddie said. "Walt likes to bring the whole crew when there's pie." And the bikes pulled into the lot. A long, disciplined row of them, chrome catching the streetlight, and the engines died one by one, and Boots came up the walk, and the heavy glass door of the Bright Star Diner swung open into the warm, and Eddie Vance, who had spent 19 years deciding he deserved to be alone, slid out of the booth to stand and greet the men coming in out of the cold. The ink on his hands, no longer a graveyard, he carried in silence, but a story he had finally, at long last, decided to let other people read. If this one warms something in you, if you have ever been judged for the marks life left on you and wished somebody would stand up, sit with that feeling for a moment before you scroll on, and if it moved you, leave a word below and stay a while. There are more stories like this one, and the door, as always, is open.